Hi guys, Coach Fenner here from FTP Training. Over the course of many years of coaching and also in conversations with most of my coaches, there's a common question that gets asked of us by a lot of our athletes, and that's the question about testing. What tests to use, why do you use them, when can we test, what do the tests tell us? Obviously testing is a great way to validate the effectiveness of a training program. We want to be able to find ways in which we can test relatively ininvasively, so we're not having to get you into labs, to quantify improvements over time. That way it gives you the motivation to know that what you're doing is working, and therefore it gives you that more morale, more froth to go out and do more of it. So let's have a little chat about testing itself, and I'll take you through a little history lesson that I've been through within sports testing, and something which helps sort of probably sort of push me in a direction of testing in a certain way or not testing in a certain way if that's the case. I go right back to probably the late 80s, early 90s. I was racing in the UK with a couple of teammates, and we wanted to sort of move up the scales. We wanted to ride at the Premier calendar level, and we wanted to get better. And we knew that there wasn't the available data that there is now. You couldn't look on Google and look up training programs and have the wealth of information that you have now. It was more the secret dark arts to a degree with coaching, and most of the time coaching was done via heart rate. Okay, power was used in the laboratories most regularly on things like an SRM, but also on a King cycle. And we found, who was just going through his PhD at the time, an incredible coach who's eminent in the field of physiology and sports testing. He's probably written, I don't know how many papers. He's been involved with British cycling for many years. It's Dr. Louis Passfield. Now, luckily, Dr. Louis Passfield, or Louis, said, yep, I'll coach you guys. So he said, I want you down to the labs at Chichester University, and I'm going to get you tested. We're going to see where the base point is, where we're starting. If you've got the minerals, basically, to sort of step up, okay? So we went down to have our first lot of sports testing. Both excited and a bit daunting. You walk into a laboratory situation, it's very sterile. You put your bike on what is a very old looking trainer, if we go back too many years, which for some that have used the sort of trainer where you just drop your wheel onto a tiny little metal roller, that they feel absolutely horrendous. But that's what they used, and that was connected to some electronics which measured power output. It's called a King cycle. It was one of the first sort of testing ergometers, basically. So but what we did is we were on the ergo, we had fans, and we did a classic British Cycling Federation incremental ramp test to Max, to Vo2 Max. Basically, it's called a Vo2 Max test, okay? You have a warm-up, and then we had a 20-watt ramp, which means that every minute 20 watts was incrementally added through the time that we were on the King cycle until we couldn't pedal anymore and we fell off the bike, basically. Starting point for us was 200 watts, and we were looking to try and achieve anywhere from sort of 9 to 11 minutes if we were really going. So we started on the testing, and all of us really probably didn't do as well as we thought. Vo2 Max was measured via Douglas bags and gas analysis, so we'd have a mask on, breathing into bags, with a lab assistant there taking the gases, and from that they can look at your expired air, and they would also count sort of breathing rate, etc. And from that they could ascertain your Vo2 Max by the volume of expelled air, and we were also having lactate analysis done. So throughout the incremental max test we'd have a baseline lactate test done, and then each through the test at specific points they would take lactate to look at the deflection point in lactate which would again allude to our training intensity and our sort of threshold. And from that, they could then work out what levels we needed to be working at, correlating to beats per minute as opposed to power. Okay. As well as that, you're looking at, you know, the fundamental test of trying to get the best power output that you can. So anyway, we didn't achieve it as well as we wanted. I think most of us came out around 65 mils per kilogram, and we got to around 420 to 430 watts on the Incremental Max test. Okay. We weren't necessarily super happy, and after conversations with Louis, it didn't represent what we did on the road, and therefore he was interested by this. So he got me back in and we did more testing. Again, it didn't reflect what I was doing out on the road. So he then decided he was going to take me to Eastbourne University to do some different testing. That testing involved doing an incremental test to max on a treadmill, a massive treadmill used for horses called a Woods treadmill. He set that at a constant gradient, and we started at a constant pace. And then after a certain amount of time, the speed would go up, and I would have to continue to pedal until I could pedal no more, and I either flew off into the big cushions and stuff that were padded all behind me, or I could hang on to the side and try and just sort of cope with it and deal with it. Again, masks and blood lactate, so quite tricky to do that while you're on a treadmill exercising. But that showed a massive increase in performance over what I had done out on the road. On the King cycle. So again, he was pretty interested by this. So a more realistic test, because obviously you're out really on a rolling road. So it was very similar to what you were going to be doing out on the road. So we ascertained that that was better for me than doing a King cycle test. And if we continued to do King cycle tests, although we could probably still make sure that the lactate would be the same, and therefore we could give our training intensities the same, it was a bit demoralising. So it wasn't great for the morale. Where you got in the woods, suddenly you hit much greater power. I got to 450 or 460 on the woods, on the treadmill. I felt buoyed, I felt great. You know, it makes you go out and feel much better. So again, many years later, those experiences in testing held true with me when it came for me to start coaching other riders. And very quickly you can suss as a coach whether the athlete performs well in testing in any environment, or we might use other ways to try and guide us to make sure that we get training intensities right, and that we can still track performance increases over time. So mostly I would say that our coaches will conduct an FTP test. I still believe it's a great test to do outside. You can do it on the ergo, and of course sometimes we've had to do that. But very often people will not be able to produce the same amount of power on the ergo. Doesn't matter what ergo it is. I believe that most of the time that's a cooling problem. Most people don't have fans big enough to create and help with our evaporative cooling. Therefore our core temperature rises, and as our core temperature rises to certain 39 degrees, in the lab and in the heat chamber I've had it up to 40 degrees before we were pulled out, as that was the ethical point. Your systems are going to not work properly. Remember that when you're exercising, most of your body is trying to say, well, I need oxygen in the working muscles, therefore I'm going to push as much of the blood supply that I can to help supply the muscles with oxygen. As soon as your core temperature rises too high, then obviously your body's trying to make sure that it doesn't break down and die. So therefore blood is redistributed around the body, often to the surface areas around the skin, which will then help with the evaporative cooling with your sweating. If you haven't got big fans on you, that isn't working optimally, and therefore you get super hot, and therefore your power you produce is not as great. So look, we can talk about that in another piece, but with regards to testing, obviously on the ergo, that's going to have a significant effect on your output, okay, and you're not going to achieve the outcome that you want. So from a coach perspective, I don't want my athletes getting demoralised during testing, because it's bad for morale, and it doesn't bode well for them getting out there and feeling that massive froth to go and smash out some great sessions. So I prefer to do the testing on the road if I can. It's less invasive, it's an easier environment, it's a better environment, it's a real environment, it's where we race. So the FTP test, 20 minutes up a hill, and we work from 95% of that power output will give us a rough estimation of your functional threshold power, and from that, as a coach, we can look and decide what levels you should be training at. Okay? If we get that wrong and we overestimate FTP, obviously it means that you're going to overestimate all of the training that you do. And as an athlete, pretty much every athlete I've ever known will always push to the upper limits of what is set in your training schedule. It's just human nature for someone that's a competitive animal, you know, a racer. You're going to say, well, Fens has set, 300 to 320 to hold in these efforts. Well, I'm going to hold 320 to 325. So if we've set FTP high and we want you to work out at 95 to 100% of your current threshold, suddenly you're working out at 100 to 105%. And your ability to recover from those efforts is significantly reduced compared to working out at, say, 90 to 95%. And therefore, over time, that can lead to fatigue, it can lead to sickness, it can lead to, just general breakdown. You can't be bothered to get out there and do it. The sessions look too hard. So it's vitally important we get that right. So if we think there's an issue there, and we look back at historical data, we can ascertain threshold quite well just by looking at the data that you've created over the course of, say, the last 3 months. But we look massively historically often to look at trends in that performance, and also look at the power meters that you've used to produce those performances. Are they different? Because obviously if they're different, they could be plus or minus 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% accuracy. Suddenly there's a huge discrepancy between one that's reading 5% under and one that's reading 5% over. So from a coach perspective, we have to go in there. Sometimes we're looking at data points that just don't look right. We've got to clear them from your data on our computer. So we get a curve that we believe is right, and then we can guide your training intensities via that and the test. I very rarely get people to go into a lab to do a Vo2 Max test. It is invasive. You have to prep for it. You don't want to be doing it during a heavy training block, because obviously you're going to be fatigued and not produce your optimal numbers. And therefore the invasiveness of that in a schedule is massive. And what does it tell us? Realistically, it will give us an estimation of your thresholds, but there are better ways, in my view, to do it. Okay, the classic FTP test is, I still believe, one of the best ways for us to develop your training intensities and for us to guide performance over time. Now, obviously, though, an FTP test really looks at your sustainable oxidative performance, okay, what you can sustain. Often races aren't won necessarily unless you're doing the tour on those big climbs. They're often won with smaller, harder intensity efforts. So therefore we can also do power profile tests. And power profile tests will look at the different part of your power peak, your peak power curve. We might look at 8 to 10 second peak power, 8 to 10 second power within testing, 1 minute power, 5 minute power, may look at 3 minute power and 10 minute power over a course of different days, testing those to see if there are areas within your power curve that we can then adjust training to make better. Again, they're all done outside. I would prefer to do all them outside, especially your higher intensity sprint type efforts. They're very, very difficult to do properly on an ergo. The ergo, whatever one you're using, cannot control the power when it's on really hard properly. You normally have to do seated efforts as well, rather than standing sprints. And I believe again, outdoor testing is going to be the best way to do that. So look, we've talked about testing in the lab. and my views on testing on the lab. People have different views. Obviously, if you're a scientist and you work in a laboratory situation, you're going to say that you're going to be a proponent of that. You're going to say that that's the best way to do it. And there are definitely ways. For some people, it's a great way to test, and knowing your Vo2 Max through testing and your lactates is vitally important. But I believe we can do it better, as I say, with a standard FTP test and then some power profiling to look at your shorter durational efforts. And then all of that guides us, doesn't it? We can look at it and say, does our 20-minute power correlate well with our 10-minute power? Obviously, our 10-minute power is a higher contribution of our anaerobic work capacity. Is our 5-minute power super high? How does the curve look? Is it dropping off too much? Does it reflect what the athlete is? Has it got too high a peak? You know, this is a guy that's 55 kilos and climbs really well, but it looks like he's a sprinter in his power profile. So testing like that, for me, looking at the data that you have as a historical data using today's plan, is, I still believe, the best way to test. Okay guys, look, lots and lots of information there on physiological testing. I hope it helps you understand how it guides us as coaches to enable us to prescribe training intensities and test performance increases over time. If you've got any questions, of course, head over to the Run Ride Race Facebook page and join it. You can send in a request and I'll accept. Get you in there. Let's start conversations on things like this, because obviously the more we converse, the better the outcome. There's lots of information and knowledge out there, and I'm always open to understand more, because we're learning all the time. So I hope, as I say, hope it's an interesting little vid, that it helps you, as it obviously helps us guide your intensity in training and make you better frothers, basically. All right then guys, well, hopefully I'll catch you out on the road or trail. I'm still frothing a bit at the moment with Richie's performance in the Tour, and I'm fingers crossed that he's gonna pull off a podium position, and I might well have to just drive up to Paris to congratulate him. All right guys, I'll catch you out on the road or trail. Bye bye.